In this video, we're going to take a look at Noodler's Chekhov. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. I am confused by the red color here. In Star Trek, the original series, Chekhov wore a gold shirt. And it was only a little bit in the newer movies where Chekhov wore red. I'm confused. Anyway, as a tone, this has a kind of matte red with only one standout feature, that being its resistance. And resistance is futile. Again, confusing, because that was the Borg from the Next Generation. So confused by this red. This does something very interesting as a waterproof ink, in that it shades on fountain pen friendly paper. So, bravo. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Jinhao 51A with a fine nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, it is lighter than we were seeing with the initial paper, and it is that matte kind of red about it. Now, it doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade. Unusual for red, unusual for permanent, and it is doing it here, and I think it does it fairly well. Even though I don't care for shading in red ink, I think what it's doing nicely. Looking at the broad nib, it is, in general, a little bit darker than we saw with the fine. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade, and shades just as well as it did with the fine. What kind of freak show of an ink is this that is such a permanent ink? It shades well. Nicely done. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone that we had with the broad. We get no feather. We get no spread. We get shading, my friend. The stub tends to bring it out, and it didn't even need to work hard here. It does it fairly well. Would it have looked even better when it shaded if it shaded too darker? Yes. But I can't complain about what it's doing. It's doing it so well. Looking at the back of the page, you see that there's no bleeding and no ghosting. Easily writing back here. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Lamy All-Star with a fine nib. A Lamy All-Star with a broad nib. A Lamy Safari with a 1.1 stub. The next writing sample is done on a WritePad's reporter pad. Looking at the fine nib, we get about the same tone that we had with the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather. It doesn't spread. It does have little bits of shading. You can see it in the word difference. The starts lighter and gets darker. German's starts darker and gets lighter. So it's definitely there, and even on this paper. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little bit darker than we had with the fine, about the same tone that we're getting on the Clairfontaine. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. It is shading pretty well. Look at the word exodus, not how horribly I had written the word, but how nicely it's coming up. Or of right next to it that is pretty light in general, but gets much darker at the end of the F. Looking at the stub nib, we have right about the same tone that we had with the broad, which is the same tone as from the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade. I think it's shaded better on the Clairfontaine than it does here, but it is shading. Now, before we get to the back of the page, it's very funny because something unusual happened here, and you can see how clean what was written on. Wait till you see the back. I apparently accidentally used the back of the page from a previous sample, which I normally don't do so I can see it easily. So what we have to do is really carefully look, and we can see that there's no bleeding or ghosting with any problem back here. Funny, but this is the first time it's happened. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get a little bit darker, just a tad bit darker than it was with the Clairfontaine. We get no feather. We get no spread. I have been very happy with the papers I've chosen on a majority for this year because I've gotten to say that so frequently. Why look at garbage paper? Why look at bad performance? This is nice. With no feather, no spread, yes, it's not really shading here, but the absorbent nature is destroying that shading in this case. Looking at the broad nib, it is darker than we had with the fine. It is a tad bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. Now, it's not shading much within the writing, but look at the word 30 on the second line and the word at on the first line. Tremendous difference in tone. So you do see difference in tone from one word to another. Looking at the stub nib, we get about the same tone as the broad. About the same tone on the Clairfontaine. There's no feather, there's no spread, there's no shading. It's just a kind of mid-tone matte red here. I won't call this bad in what it's doing because it's about the other features that this ink brings to the table than the color alone. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, easily writing back here. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get about the same tone. Almost, I'm side by side here, and I'm actually going to say the exact same tone as we did with the Clairfontaine. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. I'm going to say it's not shading, although, yes, you can go into a few areas and find a little bit lighter or a little bit darker. I don't really see it as shading so much in what's happening. Looking at the broad nib, we get a little bit darker than we had with the fine, but it is the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feather. We get no spread. We get a couple spots of shading, where I will say that it kind of is shading here in how it's performing. On the third line first at the cross of the T and downstroke of the T, or time on the E, it's areas that we typically will see some shading coming in. There's a little bit, tiny bit. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone as the broad, the same tone as on the Clairfontaine. It comes to us with no feather. It shows up with no spread. It even has a little bit of shading when it arrives. On the cross of the T of width, you see it. On the downstroke of the D of allotted, you see it. In the cross of the T into the H on the fourth line of the, you see it. And university gets darker at the Y. Looking at the back of the page, you see that it is ghosting. We are seeing it, but I believe that you could easily write back here and not have a particular problem. Nothing bled through and touched the page underneath. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Bookbinder's Red Spitting Cobra. Here is Caran d'Ache Infrared. Here is Diatramentis Poppy Red. Here is Diamine Classic Red. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, it is a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. There is a little bit of feathering going on, and there is a little bit of spread. Both of them are well manageable on this paper. There are a couple moments of shading, which gives me fear with this paper. Just this paper, it just usually isn't a good sign. Have to remind people because they may not have seen that paper before. Looking at the broad nib, it is darker than we had with the fine on this paper. It is a little bit darker than we had on the Clairfontaine. It does feather a little bit. It does spread a little bit. It does have some darker shading, and in fact, some of the shading is darker than we've seen in most any paper. And we call that, for this paper, a warning sign of bleeding to come. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone that we had with the broad. It does feather. It does spread. It does have a few spots of shading, mostly where you see that I've crossed over where I was already finished writing in a spot. When it shades, generally not good. Looking at the color on this page, I actually don't think it looks too bad. I think you could use it and not be unhappy with it. Looking at the page underneath, the stub and the broad bled through plenty, dotting the page underneath, but not the fine, meaning you could use that despite how much ghosting you do see going on here. This fine, I think you're not going to have an issue with. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here's a blue-black ink by Kaweco, Midnight Blue. Here is a gray ink by Diatramentis, their Document Fog Gray. Here is a blue ink by Montblanc, BMW. Here is a black ink by Rocher & Klinger, their Document Black. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get around the same tone as the last paper, which was a little bit darker than we had with the Clairfontaine. It feathers a little bit. It's actually a little less than the last paper. It spreads a little bit, a little less than the last paper. It does not shade, which is generally good news for us when we think about bleeding and non-fountain pen friendly paper. So I don't think this is doing too bad. Looking at the broad nib, it is darker than we had with the fine, about the same darkness as the last paper, which is a little bit darker than we had on the Clairfontaine. It does feather a little bit. It does spread a little bit. Considering that it's 20-pound copy paper, I see what it's doing as not too bad and rather manageable as long as we don't hit the 6th page underneath it. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone that we had with the broad. It feathers. Not horribly. That breath, I don't understand where that actually came from. It does feather a bit. I don't think it's horrible in its amount of feathering that's going on. It does spread a little bit. I don't think that's horrible in what's going on. It's not really shading. We don't tend to expect shading on 20-pound copy paper. I've been very pleased with how this ink is ultimately performed, considering how permanent it is. Looking at the page underneath, you can see all these spots where it did dot. Now, it looks worse because I circle it, but it really wasn't horrible. Looking at the back of the page, you couldn't write on it because of the amount of extreme ghosting, but I think this ink is good for this paper. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? Since this isn't as aggressive as many waterproof inks, you have a lot of options. But I'm old school, and when I think of red, I tend to think of editing things I'm writing or grading, so I'll spare the ink in spreading out its use some and go for a medium to dry fine, so that I can mark more things wrong on homework, because everybody knows the only thing that matters to teachers is covering a paper with red ink. I hope you got something out of this video, and if it leads to you wanting to try this ink, when you purchase it, let the retailer know where you heard about it, whether it's me or any other channel. Thanks for watching.